Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. On October 5th, Netflix released The Closer, the sixth and final special in a deal between the company and comedy legend Dave Chappelle. Chappelle's 2019 special, Sticks and Stones, came under fire for its jokes about a number of marginalized communities, but especially for the way it used LGBTQ+ people and transgender people in particular as a punchline. In The Closer, he again spends a lot of time making jokes about trans people and also defending himself against criticism coming from people he claims want to cancel him. Netflix has also been taking a lot of heat for this, not just for airing the special, but standing by it, despite the backlash it's received publicly and internally from LGBTQ+ and allied employees. The company's co-CEO, Ted Sarandos, has said Netflix doesn't allow titles on its service that are designed to incite hate or violence, and that he doesn't believe The Closer crosses that line. This has all culminated in a virtual walkout by Netflix employees on Wednesday afternoon. Today on the show, I'm talking to Imara Jones, a journalist and founder and CEO of TransLash Media.
If you take out all of the LGBTQ jokes and quotes, again, I believe that it's hate speech. I think it's hate speech that he disguised as jokes. But let's call them jokes for the sake of argument. If you take all of that content out of the special, there's not much of a special left.
Coming up, why the anger around Dave Chappelle's comedy is at an all-time high and why so many people believe it's actually dangerous. You're listening to The Decibel. Hi, Imara. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to do this.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with how watching The Closer made you feel. Like, what was running through your mind as you watched it?
Rage and revulsion and alarm because it's putting people at risk. I was enraged by, right off the bat, basically, we're into the trans jokes. Sometimes when comedians do this sort of thing where they know they're going to go to a really tough space, they'll do kind of a funny positive setup and then they'll do the knockdown. And the knockdown isn't so hard because of the setup. And his was all knockdown. It was all knockdown, every joke. So that was enraging and was intentional and just showed a crassness and a callousness, which wasn't about craft. It was about settling scores and being angry. And that came across to me. I think the audience laughing, their reaction enraged me. His casualness enraged me. The content of the jokes enraged me. I mean, honestly, it is much harder to think about what the lights didn't enrage me. But other than that, it was a pretty incendiary experience.
This isn't the first time Dave Chappelle's made jokes about trans people. Obviously, he's waded into this territory a bunch of times now. I wonder, was there something about The Closer that made it more offensive and harder to watch than the times that he's done this before?
Yes and no. I mean, I always cringed and thought it was terrible. I thought Sticks and Stones was terrible. And we know that in the wake of that, there was a suicide of a trans woman whom he mentioned in that special was his friend. There's actually a dispute amongst the people that knew her, whether or not that special played a role in her suicide. There's not agreement, but we know that it happened in the wake of that. And I would think that the normal response would be to not even want to take the risk or the chance that that type of harm could be committed again. But we had a repeat of that in The Closer. And I think it felt worse then because it seemed this time to be intentional, reckless, caring, and dismissive.
So for people who haven't watched the special and who maybe aren't familiar with the story, I'll just recap it really quickly. The crux of Dave Chappelle's defense of himself seems to be the story about his friend, the late trans comedian named Daphne Dorman. It makes up much of like the last 20 minutes of this special. And like, just to recap, Daphne Dorman was a big admirer of his and considered him a mentor, he says. And after Sticks and Stones came out in 2019, she publicly defended him. And then after she did that, she was criticized on social media by some members of the trans community and then subsequently died by suicide. And Dave Chappelle says, we don't know what was happening with her, like what was happening in her inner life. He says the dragging couldn't have helped. Her family still stands by him, calls him an LGBTQ ally, and he uses this story essentially to say this trans person was my friend and she got my jokes because she understood comedy. So what are your thoughts on what happened to Daphne Dorman and the way that Chappelle tells this story?
I think, first of all, if you take out all of the LGBTQ jokes and quotes, again, I believe that it's hate speech. I think it's hate speech that he disguised as jokes. But let's call them jokes for the sake of argument. If you take all of that content out of the special, there's not much of a special left. So people need to understand this is the very heart of the closer. This is how he's chosen to finish the televised part of his career as he tells it. It is then not normal to then spend so much time, quote, joking again about them specifically in this special. And of course, well before he gets to her, there are trans jokes that start almost from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And then again at the middle. And then Daphne at the end. So this is an intentional hit job and targeting of a community that runs right through this special from the beginning to the end.
People defending the special would say that this is just comedy. Chappelle himself says he's not punching down because he doesn't think of himself as superior to LGBTQ people, to trans people. How would you respond to that?
It's the equivalent of I'm not transphobic, but I'm not racist, but it's the thing that inoculates you before you say the transphobic or the racist thing. People are what they do, not what they say. We know that he's put out 2 specials, in part that target trans people, that dehumanize trans people. We also know that this is so bad, so egregious, that there are people at Netflix who are willing to put their careers at risk because they believe that this is so wrong. Think about that.
So Netflix's response to this has been to stand by him and defend the special. What do you make of that response?
You know, normally what happens in these instances when there's a massive controversy is that CEOs generally don't wade into that. They leave that to the people who get paid for that, namely the chief communications officer or the marketing person or even the head of content. But that didn't happen here. The statements came directly from him, the Netflix co-CEO, Ted Sarandos. Statements to employees and to the media came directly from him. And his comments were essentially, well, of course, what Dave Chappelle said doesn't harm people because there's no content that we put out as an entertainment company that can cause harm. When we know that that's not true because Netflix itself has a standards department. That's because internally they know that there's some things that people say and do that should never be seen by millions of other people around the world. He's saying that he didn't think that this rises to that and that he doesn't care. We know that the company has fired Black trans people who have spoken out and helped organize. We know that they have taken action against others who have spoken out. So this is the company's position. And I think that that's what we've learned here. We've learned that Netflix has a problem.
You and I are talking on Wednesday and Tuesday night in an interview with Variety. The CEO, Ted Sarandos, said that he should have led with more humanity in his internal responses to employees, but he still stands by the special on the grounds of artistic expression. What do you make of this artistic expression argument?
When you respect other people, your natural inclination is always to lead with humanity. I want to separate that this is about hate speech and not artistic freedom. But even if it is about artistic freedom gets to be held to account. I don't get to say whatever I want, to paint whatever I want, and to believe that people don't get to criticize it. I'm confused as to why we believe that expression is separate from accountability. Mm-hmm. If they're really about artistic expression, it would be fantastic if they actually listened to the demands that are being put forth today and made Netflix a welcoming place for trans stories and trans producers and trans content that would balance this. The problem is there's not balance.
What do you think are the consequences of Netflix taking this stance and reacting this way?
It could become a stigma to work there. And that's the biggest threat to them. Secondly, I do know personally that there are people who were in active talks with Netflix about projects who have stopped those conversations because of this, who've said, until you get straightened out on trans issues, we're not going to work with you. And I'm not having a conversation with you. There are lots of other players that are in this space now. And that combination of people not wanting to Netflix, taking their expertise that they've learned to these other streaming services, people who have projects wanting to take those elsewhere, either because of personal reasons or people that they know. And thirdly, these other competitors being willing to embrace new voices and trans content and other types of content as well, over time, I think could really diminish them. And I think that's the danger.
I just want to pivot back to the special for just a second. There are a few things that he says in the closer that people have said ignore the existence of Black LGBTQ people, or even worse, pit Black people against LGBTQ people. For example, he says, Black people look at the LGBTQ community and say, look how well that movement is going. And that, quote, gay people are minorities until they need to be white again. He says that when he's describing an incident where a gay man called the cops on him. What do you think about the way that he talks about Black people and LGBTQ people as two separate and distinct communities?
The United States has the highest numbers of murders of trans people than any other countries on the planet except for Brazil and Mexico. At the heart of those murders are Black trans women. And trans people overall, specifically trans women, specifically Black trans women, when you look at the data, have faced record-breaking years for murders for several years in a row. That's the context for his comments. And that's the dynamic in the larger community that he fed into, which is why what he said will put people at risk. It puts people at risk. You know, one of the things that makes this fight really essential is because this underscores the way in which American media is global. Not news to Canadians, not news to Canadians, but that American content and American media is global. That means that for people in Africa and South America and all the rest of it who are watching Dave Chappelle's special, he is shaping and legitimizing those views where in many of those countries, it's illegal to be trans. Trans people are murdered with impunity, are jailed. And what we've essentially done is to put out global content on a global platform that reinforces that. And that dichotomy that he sets up, it puts people at risk. It reinforces and extends white supremacy, and it's anti-Black.
So Dave Chappelle keeps saying that he's been canceled, that the LGBTQ plus community has been trying to cancel him along with people like Kevin Hart, J.K. Rowling, DaBaby. Has he been canceled in your view?
No, that's ridiculous. I think he uses the cancellation charge as a way to inoculate himself. I think that's pretty clear. Days after this special was released, he took the stage to a packed audience in Hollywood that included stars like Brad Pitt and Tiffany Haddish, who laughed and slapped their knee, what he was saying. He has not been canceled. He has not been deplatformed. What is happening to him is that he is being held to account for what he said. And that's a part of free speech. But he's not been canceled. That's ridiculous.
I think there are a group of people who will always vigorously defend Dave Chappelle, say he's the greatest of all time. He can't do anything wrong and this is just comedy. And I wonder if you can talk about like why some people have such a visceral response to any criticism of Dave Chappelle or their favorite artist who may be doing something that is hurting other people.
When you see yourself in other people and those people come under attack, it feels like you're coming under attack. I think that people see themselves both in his experience and what he says and the way that it legitimizes their deeply held views, even ones that they may not express. That feels good to them. And so when he comes under attack, it feels like they're coming under attack, and that the parts of themselves that they don't speak and that they don't reveal, but that they need fed, are coming under attack, which then amplifies the response and the outcry. That's what I think. I think people see themselves in himself and his humor, and that's frightening.
What do you make of the general public's response to the special and the conversation that's been happening around it?
At first, I was devastated because I was shocked by the number of people that rushed to defend him. I was stunned by the number of people who said that he had not said anything that was offensive, that he had not said anything that they could see any problem with, that he was right, and that he was telling the truth. Those stung and deeply cut. And they cut because they came from so many different corners, unexpected corners, from Black gay men in particular as well, but also across the board. So it was pretty disheartening. But over time, I am increasingly heartened by the courage and the fight back by Netflix employees of all backgrounds who are saying that this is wrong. I'm increasingly encouraged by people who over time are speaking out. I'm increasingly encouraged that places like the Globe and Mail are engaging in this conversation. I'm increasingly encouraged by the emerging curiosity that more people have as this controversy goes on to reevaluate and rethink their initial assessments. So I think that this conversation, honestly, the longer that it goes on, is better and is essential if we're going to make progress, because people have to first do a temperature check on themselves and where they are on trans issues, and how you react to the Dave Chappelle special is a great way to do that. And then to be forced to evaluate that and to be in conversation about that, I think can only be a good thing.
Imara, thank you so much for your time. You've been so generous, and thank you so much for your very thoughtful analysis and insight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking forward to hearing this. This is exciting.
So before we let you go, just a quick note that on Wednesday morning, a Netflix spokesperson said in a statement, "We value our trans colleagues and allies and understand the deep hurt that's been caused. We respect the decision of any employee who chooses to walk out and recognize we have much more work to do both within Netflix and in our content." And that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandakar. Our producers are Madeline White, Cheryl Sutherland, and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Imara Jones. You can find her on Twitter at Imara Jones. If you want to reach us, you can email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at Anima_TK. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.